First of all, I wanted to say that Nava raised a whole string of very fascinating and interesting and important questions that I hope will be discussed in the afternoon session of roundtable discussion. Shlomo, I agree with many things that Shlomo said, in particular to the observation and data that he brought, that yes, we do have in Israel today an excellent set of universities and higher education system trying to be most excellent and provide access, wide access. It is exactly because the concerns I have about the future of the excellence and the future of the system that I think this conference, this colloquium was convened. Past success does not necessarily, is not necessarily a proof for future success. And I think our future is at risk. So the creation of the Israeli higher education system began with universities and not colleges. As such, it was built top-down and not bottom-up. In 1948, when the State of Israel was established, there were already 3 universities in existence, and the rest of the universities followed later in the expansion of the 60s and 70s. And as far as future additional research universities are concerned, we heard Professor Grossman's comment, and also that possibly a private university may evolve, that one doesn't negate the other. At the time when the State of Israel was established and the universities already existed, there were very many post-secondary educational institutions in the country. And, but both the general public and the government perceived the higher education system as consisting of universities. That was the general understanding. And it is not surprising that the law of higher education, legislated between 1950 to 1958, and the legal pillar of our whole system, which established the Council of Higher Education, Malag, the Hebrew acronym, and I'll use that one, as the sole, and it was the sole legal accreditation body until present day, and the law focused primarily on universities. Now, the enactment of Malag and the ensuing creation of the Planning and Budgeting Committee, the Hebrew acronym is VATAT, PVC, Shlomo always reminds me of PVC, being in plastics, so I'd rather use VATAT. That completes the first stage in the higher education development, stage 1. Now, the growing demand for broader access to higher education, which began to assert itself already in the 1950s, and it continues ever since, really ushered in the second stage of the development of the Israeli higher education system, and that is the beginning of the transition from an elite system to a mass educational system. And this took place in 2 steps. First, there was a concerted effort to increase the number of qualified students to the universities by creating a network of second-chance academic preparatory schools at the initiative of Malag and the Ministry of Education at the time and Defense. And these schools offered training for those students who failed in high school, a second chance, and for those that serve in the military and have forgotten pretty much what they studied in high school and they need refreshment. And this was a great success. It is today, and it stood the test of time. The second step in the creation of the network of colleges granting academic degrees goes back to 1971 decision of Malag, which appointed the Schneur-Lifshitz Committee. Lipson, I'm sorry. Sorry, they sound alike. The Schneur-Lipson Committee, Yoshua Yortner, who is speaking after me, was member of that committee. Now, that committee, way back at that time, decided on 3 major steps, which were revolutionary at the time. The gradual development of a network of colleges, an establishment of the Open University, both have been done, and the creation of Center for Secondary Education at Malag, which I don't know what happened with it. Now, the latter policy, ever since, is consistently followed by Malag, and Vatat, in spite of some knee-jerk opposition of universities, who took their time in comprehending that colleges are, in fact, a safety belt around universities, protecting them from political-driven expansion and for open admission. Now, as far as I recall, the issue of the broad access and the need for colleges spilled over in the vocal public and political arena in the 1980s. At the time, I was member of Malag, and as I recall, the demand for broader higher education, for broader access and new colleges came from first the circles of the rich and powerful lawyers in the country, and on one hand, on the other hand, it came from ordinary mortals, which are the engineering and technician students. At the time, law could only be studied in the universities. The demand was high, the academic requirements were tough, and as it turned out, not all the children, the sons and daughters of the lawyers could get into the universities, so they demanded to open up colleges and the colleges should grant them degrees. Otherwise, you'll have to send all their children to England, as they did at the time. They succeeded in the process. In fact, they have overdone it because the number of graduates from law school is so high that it threatens their profession. The technician story is quite different. We in Israel used to educate what's called high technician, handesaim, contrary to regular technicians. The handesaim at some point, and there were very many of them, and they also had a powerful union. The handesaim wanted to get additional education and get an engineering degree. Now, the Israeli universities didn't respond so nicely to that request, so they went, large numbers of them, to second and third-tier universities in the United States, who were more liberal in acceptance, and in a year or two they got an academic degree. This issue was picked up by the Knesset, became politicized, and accusations were leveled against the universities that because of their ivory tower political policies, young men and women must leave the country. And that's when it became so vocal and public. So against this backdrop, the universities gradually, rightly or wrongly, began to be perceived as conservative strongholds holding on to their turf and blocking the expansion of higher education system. Also, it wasn't exactly like that. Nevertheless, the second stage of the evolution of the higher education system was a great success. Many new academic colleges were set up with the active support of Vatat and Malag. Noteworthy is the period in the 1990s when a systematic, proactive, yet controlled program of expanding the academic degree-granting colleges was enacted by Amnon Pazi, who was chair of Vatat, during his tenure and during his successors. The intention was clearly to create a lower cost per student, non-research body of colleges side by side with the universities, and thus expand access yet retain quality and excellence. By the way, at the same time, because of the huge Russian immigration, the universities also expanded very significantly their student bodies. So the result is a higher education system with 7 universities, 1 open university, and 53 regional technological, academic, non-academic, teacher training, and private colleges, roughly. Shlomo has shown you that we have about 168,000 students in the system, plus 32,000 in the open university. Pardon? 38,000 in the open university. It changes every day. So we have a very significant expansion and very, very significant numbers. Well, this brings us to the more problematic third stage of the evolution, which began in the last few years. It continues ever since, and its roots, I believe, go back to the mid-1990s. In this stage of in this last stage, and in the wake of the major expansion of the higher education system, the regulatory institution overseeing the whole system began to exhibit weaknesses, in my opinion. They began yielding to political and other powerful forces, undergoing transformations, and by and large began failing to meet key requirements of their original mission. In fact, a mismatch between their original mission and reality began to surface, which is being exploited by some, in particular politically. this can be primarily, this development primarily affects the status of the research universities in the country, but in my opinion, and in the final analysis, and in the long term, it is just as detrimental to the colleges, to our colleges as well. So in this third stage of evolution, I believe, my slides are off. This third stage of evolution that I just described, I think brought the whole higher education system to crisis and to its moment of truth. Because its resolution may determine the nature and quality of Israeli higher education for years to come, perhaps indefinitely. This is the reason for convening this colloquium and try to learn from the experiences of other countries that went through the same process, going from elite education to mass education. How did they cope with the problem of access and excellence? Now, by regulatory institutions, I mean, of course, Malag, the Council of Higher Education, the Planning and Budgeting Committee, the PBC, Vatat, which was established by governmental decision. Operating, however, in parallel to these two legal institutions are two additional ones, or a few additional ones. One is the Council of the Presidents of the Universities, acronym VERA, Vad Rashei Universitaot, and now there is a new one, I understand, the College VERA, which has been established, and the Council of Faculty Unions, which is also work together, mostly in professional matters. So these are the legal, and they create some checks and balances. But behind the scene, there is the all-powerful budgeting department of the Ministry of Finance, which allocates the funds and to Vatat, and in fact they allocate the funds to the whole country. And ministers, Knesset members, ambitious politicians, and others that normally start to intervene into matters of higher education for better or worse, mostly for worse. Now I want to go back just a little bit to the development of or the enactment or the legislation of the law of higher education. Hanoch spoke briefly yesterday at our dinner. It took 6 years by the Knesset in the 1950s to hammer out the law of higher education of Israel, which established the Malag as the sole accreditation body in the country. And this law is the pillar of the whole system, as I mentioned. It specifies that 2/3 of the members of the Council must be individually appointed, internationally renowned scientists of high standing in the higher education, and the lawmakers passed this particular section in the law with the intention to retain the higher education system out of the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. They felt that if scientists would be deciding over the future policies of the higher education, matters will be decided upon their merit and not upon interest. Note that though 2/3 ought to be scientists, they are not representatives of universities. They are individually appointed. When I was member of Malag, never ever did the president of the Technion at the time called me in and asked me how did I vote and what did I say. It was up to me, and I think that goes on for everybody and all universities. People are responsible for the assembly. You receive the appointment from the President of the State of Israel. Not less importantly, it granted to universities and other higher education institutions full autonomy for managing their academic and administrative affairs within their allocated budget. Now, it is perhaps interesting to analyze the reasons behind the lengthy legislative process, which is described very nicely in Dr. Ami Volansky's forthcoming book that the Nieman Institute will be publishing in a short time. Shortly after the creation of the State of Israel, the government dominated by the Ben-Gurion Mapai party, matter-of-factly and without hesitation intended to use the universities as nation-building tools in the hands of the state. Only the stubborn resistance of members of Knesset of the opposition parties, like Elimelech Rimalt and Shoshana Persitz, from the General Zionist Party, Yohanan Bader and Raziel Naor from Herut and others, precursors of the current Likud party, prevented that. They insisted that the council be made up not of governmental representatives as suggested, neither of representatives of universities, as I said, and certainly not politicians, but rather leading individually appointed scientists representing not their institutions but only themselves. This is necessary, they correctly argued, and it's fascinating to read the discussion in the Knesset, in order to make sure that the system will not be politicized and that their decision will be accepted by the academia without questions because of their prestige. And that's a very important point. They compared system, centrally controlled system, to what the universities in the Demokratiot Hamamiot, which were the Eastern European communist system, which are totally state-controlled and produced nothing in science and were poor quality. And that was the comparison they used. They were also the ones who insisted that full autonomy be granted to the universities in order to secure total academic freedom for the faculty, which is a prerequisite, they said, for high-quality scientific research, both in sciences and the humanities. Now, the creation of Vatat, the second most important body, took not 6 years, but 20 years of deliberation until it was established in 1977 in the general format of the British Grants Committee. That was the model that Alon, who was Minister of Education at the time, used. And it was at the very end, by the way, of the Rabin government. And as Ami tells me, that was the way to pass it because the politicians were busy in planning. Pardon? The last decision. So they squeezed it in at the last decision to get it done because all the problems that they had. And that's a good rule for anybody who wants to introduce a change, because at that time, politician ministers are busy with their own future and they don't pay attention to what is on the table. So you can squeeze in stuff. זה מה שאומרים, 20 שנה לקחת שהדבר הזה יתבצע. That's what I meant. So anyhow, the status and mission of Vatat was discussed before. I won't go into that. But the primary idea, the main idea, the central theme is a buffer between the government and the higher education system, universities at the time. And the fact that this need for such a buffer was understood at the time when everything in the country, as Hanoch pointed out, everything was centralized, from industry to education, that they let an academic system like that, independent academic system like that, develop at the time, is really a fantastic accomplishment. First, for the opposition parties at the time who pushed it, and second, for Mapai and the government to understand the significance. So that was a great accomplishment. Now, for about 30 years, this system, this rather delicate and complex system with its checks and balances, has operated with surprising stability and created, in the process, a system that I think we all can be proud of with its results. And Shlomo pointed it out. We do have accomplishments that are outstanding. 2 Nobel Prizes came a little bit late, but finally they came. But when I was president there, I had many delegations coming from the Far East asking us, how are you, a small country of nothing, at that time we were less than now, can produce so much in science? What is the secret? And I didn't know the secret, so I didn't tell them what is the secret. But certainly, normally science and excellence, they succeed when the environment supports them. When the environment is for science and learning is important, then intellectual accomplishments flourish. When not, they don't. And that's our future. And I'm afraid that a series of events and developments, these institutions and bodies that are controlling our system, for the last decade or so have begun to dysfunction, putting at risk the very accomplishments that we have, that we cherish and we want to retain. First, Well, I'm missing. Oh. First came what I call the weakening of the status and standing of Vatat and its capacity to guard and protect the higher education institution from inappropriate governmental intervention. This was the consequence of a gradual deterioration between Ministry of Finance and Vatat. For a long time, there was a close and trusting relation between Vatat and the Ministry of Finance. This became the foundation on which the stability of the whole system rested. Three former heads of Vatat, two of which are present today, Yaakov Ziv and Chaim Harari, and Amnon Paziv, the third one, they jointly represent about 15 years or so of chairing that important body, and I'm sure they can attest to this good relation period. One positive result of these very good relations that existed at the time was the 5-year plan that Shlomo described, and as Shlomo mentioned, no other body in Israel has a 5-year plan approved by the Ministry of Finance, not even IDF, not even the Israeli army. Only Vatat has that. And the other one is that finance gave Vatat freedom what to do. Vatat disbursed the allocated funds as it saw fit. They didn't intervene at the time. In this period, one can say that the budgeting committee of the Ministry of Finance was the guardian angels of the universities of Israel and the whole system as a whole. Now, this is no longer so. The roots of the crisis, I believe, of the alienation between universities and finance go back to the faculty strike of 1994. At the time, I was president of the Technion and personally involved in all the developments that took place. And in a nutshell, what happened, the faculty demanded a salary hike. We at Vera, the Vad Rashia Universitat, the Council of the President, agreed because we felt that the salaries are so low that it would be very difficult to protect the quality of the system for the future, established a public commission, Chera Commission, which recommended about 30-plus salary hike. The faculty rejected it. They wanted 3 times more. The strike broke out. It lasted about 3 months, and the end of the strike was that they got about 30-plus salary hike and some not insignificant bonuses. So they accomplished something. But the Ministry of Finance interpreted this experience that the faculty unions controlled the senates and the universities, and that this attested to the failure of university managements to rule, though it was far from being accurate. And the government, via Vatat, appointed the public commission, the Maltz Commission, the Supreme Court Maltz Commission, in order to examine and recommend appropriate changes in university governance to reduce faculty power, to strengthen outside controls, and to strengthen presidential power. And the main recommendation of that committee are, very briefly, adopt a unitary governance headed by a president and not president-rector, which I fully support, and I gave evidence before the commission and tried to recommend it. But they went too far then. They recommended to redefine the role of board of governors, which is a deadly thing because sooner or later all our major donors that sit on those boards will leave and will not support anymore the universities because they left them without any power, any influence. Appoint a dominant council which holds extensive executive powers, and I think excessive executive powers, which may bring about a politicization of the whole system. Adopt a 71-member Senate to replace the current very large Senate. You can argue for, you can argue against. There are many ways to solve a problem. Appoint deans rather than elect them, fine. Either way it can go. Retain the autonomy of the university through secure student rights, fine. Now what happened is that the committee recommendations were sent to the universities to study and comment. And now, after the faculty unions, in my opinion, committed a major error, strategic error in prolonging the strike with excessive demands, the universities followed suit, delaying any serious discussion on the Maltz Committee recommendations and virtually rejecting them. Even though quite a number of them, at least the most important one, I think it's a correct recommendation. This action, or rather inaction toward willingly adopting any change, was interpreted by the government as a slap on the face. And they got offended. How a government gets offended, I don't know, but they got offended and they were angry. And They tried via legislation, time and again, to impose a new governance on the universities, unsuccessfully, but not because of lack of trying. And finally, they forced a joint committee. They brutally, with brutal force, they forced a committee of Malag and Vatat to impose on the universities and colleges a governance structure which is roughly, there are some changes, but which is roughly an extreme derivative of the Maltz Committee recommendation, which was the recommendation of the representative of the Budget Committee of the Ministry of Finance to the committee, but it was not accepted by the Maltz Committee because it was too extreme. Well, that was more or less enforced on the universities. The cynicism of the evidence offered by the government for this act of rape of university autonomy staggers imagination. They claim that the huge deficits accumulated in the universities are not a result of brutal budget cuts of about 20% in a very short time, but because of inappropriate governance structure in most universities. I wonder how the universities, for example, the Technion, succeeded to manage for 80 years without that kind of governance very successfully and without major deficit. How can one claim that after making a 20% budget cut, obviously everybody gets into trouble, because no university in the world can absorb such a cut in such a short time, and then claim, oh, you are in trouble because you don't know how to manage your affairs. We have to change the governance. Not only that you have to change the governance, we'll tell you how to change the governance because we know better. Who? The bureaucrats in the budgeting committee of the Ministry of Finance? Did they run many universities? Did they run a grocery store? So they decided how it should be done, and that's what was imposed on the university. And this untested governance that was imposed, and which was accepted by the universities, will cause, I believe, in the long term, damage. It is rather sad and discouraging that Malag and Vatat, the same bodies that the raison d'etre is to protect independence of the higher education system, became the tool for its violation. Now, Professor Grossman and members of his Malag-Vatat committee, Shlomo Sari, claimed that the law wasn't really violated, and that the new government was not imposed on the universities by force because the presidents of the universities agreed to impose it themselves on their institution. But Shlomo, with all due respect, the most generous view of this argument that I can find would be to say that the president received in the spirit of Marlon Brando's Godfather an offer they couldn't refuse. The bottom line of these events is that Vatat, unfortunately, no longer enjoys the status it used to have. Finance does not respond as it used to. It is no longer the former guardian angel, and decisions are being made in the government, Knesset and Malak, contrary to Vatat's better judgment. Professor Grossman is trying valiantly to rebuild an atmosphere of trust, to his credit, but I am afraid his efforts after all that happened may be like trying to squeeze the toothpaste back into the tube. I hope not. Now, in parallel to the weakening of Vatat came what, at best and in the most delicate way, could be termed as the taming of Malag by Minister of Education, Culture and Sports, Ms. Limor Livnat, and converting it into a tool promoting her agenda. All former ministers of education, coming from left or right or religious party, acted as chair ex officio of the Malag, as stated in the law, and didn't try to change it, to subjugate it, to promote personal political agendas. Not that they didn't have one. Every one of them had one. But they respected the independence of Malag. They also traditionally appointed a retired Supreme Court judge as vice chair, which offered prestige and secured strict observance of the law. Ms. Livnat? Okay, I think I can more or less make it. Ms. Livnat diverged from these practices and acts more like the head of the Malag rather than chair. Moreover, she became slowly perceived as the real head of the system, rather than the head of Vatat, who is the real head of the system, and with increasing frequency, people from academia and outside turn to her in matters of higher education, which is wrong. This was not the intention of the lawmakers. They recognized the conflict of interest between a person in charge of the massive higher education of the country and the more delicate higher education system. Otherwise, they would have placed the whole system into the Ministry of Education. But they separated. They created Malag. And they made the Minister of Education just ex officio chair of Malag. And that's a big difference from being a head of something. She also, contrary to tradition, failed to appoint a retired Supreme Judge as vice chair of Malag, yet she selected and appointed for the first time the director of Fatad, denting the strict non-political status of this important body. Nothing against the current director of Malag Shosh. It's the principle that was involved here, which is wrong. Moreover, after publishing a rather vitriolic attack in the press on the universities as bastions of ossified professors whose main goal in life is to protect their turf, she forcefully reshaped the Malag, with the declared objective of reducing university representation. There is no such thing as university representation. There's only individually appointed people based on their own record. She justified it by the fact that the law requires Malag members to come from a variety of the institution, which is true, but disregarded the fact that the new Malag may not meet the other more central requirement of the law, requiring 2/3 of the member to be scientists of international reputation and high standing. Clearly, reality changed, and the law must be updated because it is hard or impossible to meet both requirements, and perhaps instead of stretching the jacket to the breaking point to fit reality, we should begin a serious dialogue to reconsider the structure of the whole system, of all the controlling bodies of the universities. And our organization, Bashar, appointed a committee coordinated by Hagit Messer-Yaron, with Dan Turkovsky and Misha Arens are members of, in order to look at alternative possible structure, just as a public service, not to intervene in anything. The new Malag appointed by Ms. Livnat is quickly changing the scene, the higher education scene. It is this new Malag that approved the setting up of the Joint Malag-Vatat Committee, which I think was a wrong step. It is this new Malag that approved research master's degrees in colleges, and which is about to set up rules how colleges can become universities. Now, within the constraints, financial constraints, and in fact the eroding allocation of budgets of higher education, this last development, a systematic conversion of colleges to universities, research universities, are threatening the whole system, because the end results might be a whole bunch of mediocre universities. And because the budget is very limited, there is no alternative but to do it at the expense of the universities. So it does not go in a direction to retain increased access and retain excellence. It cannot. It's impossible. I talked yesterday to Professor Grant Harman, who will speak to you today or tomorrow, what happened in the Australian system. Similar changes took place, but with a lot of additional budgets. Here they want to do it without a budget, or in fact a deteriorating budget. It is not possible. So we are on our way, I'm afraid, toward a mediocre system, losing all our accomplishments in the past. Now, who is to blame? Now, the blame doesn't lie entirely with Malag or the Minister of Finance or Ms. Livnat. Part of the blame certainly lies with the universities, and we cannot come out clean from this story. First of all, the faculty unions that prolonged the strike, it was damaging. Second, the universities for arrogantly refusing the Maltz Committee recommendation, it was a historic mistake. Third, the universities for failing to conduct open, productive dialogue with the colleges. For a long time ago, the university president should have sat down with the college president and discussed the matter and the issue, and not let it happen and grow wild. Fourth, the universities for failing to adopt a fair student transfer policy from colleges to universities. This, young people, men and women in Israel that go to colleges must feel that the whole system is open to them and they can go all the way, that nobody stops them. That's the secret success of the California system. People feel that it's open. Here we closed it. It was a big mistake. The universities for failing to create a dialogue with the Knesset and the government. The only time a dialogue is created when the government makes something bad, and then the universities go and object to it. But there is not a productive dialogue between the two. The universities for failing to reach out in time to the underprivileged in the society. Now they do. For a long time they didn't. That was a huge mistake. That gave a bad image to the universities. And not because of bad will, because everybody is busy with his own job to do what he thinks is most important, but he didn't have the vision to do it. And I was part of that. The faculty as a whole for acting as bystanders, showing no willingness to stand up and protect their independence and their rights. But there are others also who are to be blamed, and foremost the Ministry of Finance for leading an aggressive, unfounded intervention into the university governance in violation of the law, as I see it. The government for the devastating budget cuts that place research universities at risk after 8 years of hard work. Most of us invested into these universities our lifetime in work, and now we see it crumble, or at risk in crumbling. Even Shlomo pointed out that funds are limited. He tries to live within what you have, but that's not the way to build a future. They think, the government thinks that like the high-tech explosion, there's no problem, a new wave of innovation will come about. They are wrong. The high-tech explosion came from 50 years of heavy investment into defense industries, plus good universities. The next wave is going to come from the universities, mostly biology and chemistry. And if we don't invest very heavily in the universities now, we'll have nothing in 10, 15 years. And the better students will leave the country, and the professors, the young, talented faculty from abroad will not come back. And we are going to end up here with universities on the scale of a Philippines or Albania. Unfortunately, the taming of Vatat went hand in hand with ineffectiveness of Vera, and because of differences in opinion, and Vera ought to be a much stronger entity, and Alex Kainan is distributing a proposal here on reshaping Vera. A good example, by the way, is the new issue on tuitions. And when the government made a decision that they want to reform tuition in a certain way, which I think it's unbaked and unconvincing, 3 presidents, not our president, he didn't say anything, 3 presidents came out and said 3 different things. So with that kind of coordination, it's very hard to stand up to powerful government. So now I'm coming to the end. Right? The story of higher education in Israel as a whole is a good story, has many protagonists, some heroes and some less. But unless a new social contract is worked out, and the colleges and universities work together with government and lawmakers to agree on how to secure access side by side with excellence, we may end up with a big, messy, market-dominated, mediocre system. This is a great risk in a society in which democracy is shallow, and in which universities and colleges have such an important role to play in strengthening its foundation, and which the economy and even sheer long-term survival as a free and independent nation depends so much on the quality of graduates and the quality of scientific research. Thank you. Now I'm done. There is an hour and a half or so of open discussion in the afternoon, so there will be plenty of time of questions.
So we'll take just 2 questions, I think, to allow our next speaker the full share of his time. Yes, go ahead, please.
Please identify yourself because we want to record it.
Michael Bertuz, Weizmann. Who do you think will sit in this dialogue, given that Vera is not what it should be, and certainly the government was not enticed so far to get into any serious dialogue?
First of all, I think Vera ought to play an important role. I think Vatat ought to be partnered with it, with Malag or against Malag, I don't know. I think also that some sort of a commission ought to be created by the academia, by Vatat and Vera, in order to look at the long-term implementation and consequences of what's going on, to rethink, in a way, the system. And I think the faculty members, you and I and others, ought to stand up and not watch as bystander what's going on and what happens. Now, I think in the Knesset, you can find many friends. I had the experience of talking to many Knesset members. Very many of them are sympathetic. They are not approached. Many of them understand the seriousness of the problem, but there are other problems, and they are busy with other things. And if you don't go and bug them and talk to them, they won't do anything. There is even a lobby of Knesset members for the academia, which has to be activated. So I think there is a lot of raw material in different places that could be pulled together and to create a movement in order to change things. Because the risk that the current situation or directions that we are going are too high.
Last question, Moti Schechter.
Just a comment. Put back what you have there. Point number 3. You've just said, it's Moti Schechter, president of the Chai Academic College. You just said that there should be set up a committee of Vera and Vatat to think about reshaping the system. There is a third body called Varam, okay?
Two Veras.
Let's take it into consideration, okay?
Yeah, I agree. No,
It was a slip tongue, I guess.
That's the problem. You see, we fall into a kind of thinking and disregard that. And that's why, because of lack of dialogue. If we had a dialogue, it wouldn't have happened to me.